and a massive strategic mistake in Putin pursuing those policies. And we did all we could to warn in advance. We did all we could.
Is part of this because Lavrov isn't part of the security circle that surrounds Putin? He's not part of the St. Petersburg grouping. He's part of the Moscow foreign policy set that doesn't have much influence anymore?
Well, that could well be true, but the Defence Secretary also delivered those messages to his counterpart. The National Security Advisor delivered messages to his counterpart. You know, many leaders have had direct meetings with Putin where they've delivered these messages. So we can speculate about why it was that Putin has made this strategic mistake and ended up cornered, essentially. But I felt our role as the United Kingdom was to do all we could in advance to deter a Russian invasion.
In recent months, many of us have spoken about networks of democracies, and the Prime Minister expanded the G7 to a sort of a D10 in Carbis Bay in Cornwall. You've spoken about a network of liberty. Do you think that the events of the recent weeks give encouragement to that?
I think it demonstrates the vital importance of working with our allies, including non-democracies, because every country that is a sovereign nation that believes in a rules-based system doesn't want to live in a world where a country can be invaded just because another country declares it's not a real country. So I think it is very important for us to build that very strong network with the G7. I think we can do more to strengthen the G7, give it a more permanent footing. You know, the G7 has been instrumental in coordinating sanctions in this crisis, but I would like to see it on a more permanent footing, like a secretariat, having that infrastructure, the type of infrastructure that NATO has, other organisations have, I think would be good. I want to see it broadened. And you know, there are 141 countries that voted against Russia at the UN General Assembly. You know, we should be getting all of those countries to put sanctions on Russia. So there's an opportunity to build a wider network. And then separately for the United Kingdom, we have been active, you know, with AUKUS, in deepening relationships with the Gulf, in deepening relationships with India. All of these deeper economic and security relationships are vitally important to pull countries into the orbit of rules-based, sovereign, freedom-loving nations and away from the orbit of authoritarian regimes, namely Russia, but also China.
One country that you mentioned there, which is, as you know, very important to the United Kingdom, and one that this committee is focused on a lot, is India, of course. And I know your colleague sitting on your left has formerly served in Pakistan, but perhaps you could give us a slight perspective on why you think that India didn't sign or didn't vote alongside the other 141.
Well, I have spoken to my counterpart, Minister Jaishankar, and encouraged India to stand against Russia and made it very clear that we see this as a violation of sovereignty that every country that believes in freedom and democracy should absolutely abhor. I think the issue for India is there is some level of dependence on Russia, both in terms of its defence relationships, but also in terms of its economic relationships. And I think the way forward is for a closer economic and defence relationship with India, both by the United Kingdom, but also by our like-minded allies. And that's one thing. I've already been to India as Foreign Secretary. We are working on those closer security links. We've done joint exercises, for example. We had the Carrier Strike Group operating with India. We're looking at areas like security. We're now negotiating a trade agreement. But this is the way that we are going to bring India closer into a circle of countries that support freedom, democracy and sovereignty.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in two very short interventions. Bob, you wanted?
Can I just follow up, Tom, just what you were saying about deterrence? I'm just wondering if you have a considered opinion why deterrence failed, because Putin declared in 2007 he didn't like the post-Cold War order anymore. the following year, the Georgian War, 2014, the first Ukrainian war, in order to prevent those countries from physically being able to enter NATO? Was it the German dependency on gas? Was it our dependency on, or our liking for Russian money? Why do you think deterrence failed?
I think post-Cold War, the West took its eye off the ball. Defence budgets were cut. There was too much entering into trade and economic relationships without understanding the underlying strategic dependency that would lead to. So that's particularly true of hydrocarbons, which are, of course, a major part of the Russian economy, but it's also true of technology exports. So we enabled, and I don't just mean Britain, I mean the wider West, enabled the development of Russian high-tech warfare. We essentially provided the funding through oil and gas, and everything from financial services to broader parts of the service economy were integrated with Russia, despite the fact that we saw what happened in 2008, we saw what happened in 2014. The Munich Security Conference in 2007, Putin made it pretty clear what his intentions were. So there's no doubt that the West didn't act early enough or more decisively enough. The reality is that President Putin did not take the threats of deterrence seriously enough.
What are we going to do now, do you think?
Well, what we have to do now is we have to strengthen NATO. We particularly have to strengthen the eastern flank. We've already deployed more troops into Estonia, but there is more to do. We have to be serious about defence spending right across NATO. I'm very pleased that Germany have reversed their position on supplying defensive weaponry into Ukraine, but also on the defence budget and the energy budget. And all of the free world need to rethink their economic dependence. And we've already started working on that with China. For example, disconnection of Huawei, reducing strategic dependency on China. But that is what we need to do with Russia. Hydrocarbons is the biggest example, but more broadly, our economic policy needs to be seen much more through the light of geopolitics.
So you're making the argument for increased defence spending now?
I do support.
In the UK?
Well, I'm pleased that we've already increased our defence budget and are spending more on defence. I'm not going to preempt the decisions of the Defence Secretary and the Chancellor at this meeting of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but I am making the point that over the last 15 years, it is clear that NATO has not done enough. And that's not just in terms of spending, it's also in terms of technological development, it's also in terms of the security architecture. And what Russia has done has shattered the security architecture of Europe. And it's not just shattered the security architecture of Europe, it's sent shockwaves around the world. And this is why South Korea are applying sanctions on Russia and why Japan are applying sanctions on Russia. Because if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, of course it's devastating for European security, but it also sends a signal to aggressors elsewhere around the world.
Thank you. Alicia.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for coming before us. You just looked at how in the last 15 years we failed to do enough. Looking at the last 6 months, you said that we need to do as much as possible. And it seems like our intelligence was so solid and certain invasion was coming. And indeed, when we were in Ukraine, our Five Eyes intelligence partners and Baltic intelligence partners told us there'd be an invasion within 4 weeks. It was 6 weeks, but close enough. Did we consider at any point with our allies a preemptive or proactive measure, for example, putting in place a no-fly zone first, given that we were so certain this invasion was coming? Were there any discussions about doing something proactively and preemptively to stop Putin before he crossed the border?
The proactive thing that we were doing was supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine, and we were the first European country to do that. It was quite controversial at the time. Others didn't necessarily want to follow. We're now seeing a much wider range of countries giving defensive weapons to Ukraine. So we led the way on that.
Yeah.
The issue with the no-fly zone is that Ukraine is not part of NATO.
No, it's not.
And it's a difference. There is a difference between us helping Ukraine in their self-defense under the UN Charter and actively becoming involved. And that is the difference. So we were pushing very hard with our allies for more defensive support into Ukraine. What's our overall strategy to ensure Putin loses in Ukraine? And of course, we tried to deter him by being public about this. But the first part of the strategy is supporting Ukraine economically. So we had the Ukraine-UK forum. Dmytro Kuleba came over to London. We were supplying support for the Navy. We supplied UK support for energy, strengthening Ukraine economically, but also making sure they had the defensive weapons they need. And in fact, we started this in 2015. Yeah. Operation Orbital, training up the soldiers and so on. The second part that we agreed on internationally was the sanctions package. So by December at the G7 foreign ministers had agreed there would be severe sanctions. And we were very clear in our messaging to Moscow that there would be severe sanctions. I think there's a question about how seriously they took that and why they didn't take it seriously, but we were very clear with the messaging. The third part of the strategy is isolating Russia in the international community. And part of the way of doing that was calling out what they were doing in advance of the invasion. So we've been much more active in disseminating information, releasing intelligence to show the Russian playbook.
Forgive me, there's a difference though between bolstering and calling out. Was there any meaningful discussion about, and it didn't need to be within a NATO context, it could have been bilateral between the UK and our Baltic and Eastern European partners, it could have been with the US, between actually doing something on the ground that would prevent that action? Because it seemed like the Defence Secretary was very clear from as far back as October that we wouldn't be going in, despite the fact that we signed a treaty with the Ukrainians saying we would protect them were this to ever happen.
I think it's absolutely fair to say that at NATO, we're very clear about the Article 5 responsibility we have towards fellow NATO allies and how that is different from the situation in Ukraine. We were the most forward-leaning in Europe on supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine. Others were, have taken time. I mean, most countries are now supplying those defensive weapons. But to what you're saying, Alicia, given that they weren't even in the space of supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine, we were not going to end up in the space where they wanted active intervention. And there are all kinds of issues with active intervention, which would bring NATO in direct conflict with Russia, which is a escalation. But certainly the discussions we were having were around sanctions, economic dependency, and they were around supplying support to Ukraine, because that's what we were able to do at the time.
Andrew.
Foreign Secretary, you spoke about strengthening NATO and also alluded to the importance of spending more on defence, which I think is vitally important. But we have, in the United Kingdom, played our part for many years. Others have not done so. Others have not been spending the same level on defence that we've been doing. And other countries in Europe have failed to join NATO, yet it is really their duty to be part of NATO. And I think of Sweden, Austria, I think of the Republic of Ireland. Isn't it time that we urge them to play their part as well and join the NATO family?
Well, there are quite a few countries that want to join NATO that haven't been able to, and it is a decision for NATO members. I think what has happened as a result of this crisis, which has been a huge wake-up call for Europe, is that countries are changing their entire energy policy, their entire defence policy, their entire sanctions policy as a result of this. And we do need to re-look at European security architecture. It needs to be tougher, it needs to be stronger, there needs to be much stronger support on the eastern flank. And everybody in NATO and beyond has to play their part in it. Of course, we've got the JEF arrangements with the Nordic states. That is very positive and very much welcomed by Sweden and Finland and others. But we need to do more. And to the chairman's question originally on our foreign policy, I was very clear about the objectives of the Network of Liberty, which was developing closer security partnerships, closer economic partnerships with countries around the world to help create better economic and better defensive security in the long term. The issue is now we have an immediate crisis because we didn't do enough, and I'm not just talking about Britain, I'm talking collectively we haven't done enough for the past 20 years.
Can I bring you back then to the network point that you make? Because one of the great strengths that the UK advertises, and quite rightly, is the network building effect that the Foreign Office has or has had over several generations. Do you think the 5% real terms cut in FCDO spending from 2019-20 through to 24-25 will help that network building or hinder it?
On the subject of Foreign Office budget and resources, I would always like more budget and resources. One of the things that pains me more than anything is the fact that over the years we've sold off some of our embassy buildings. I think that's a huge mistake, and I certainly don't want to see any more of that happen. And I always want to make sure that we have enough diplomats out in the field and here in London. I'm sure the Permanent Secretary will say more about this, but we are protecting the number of people in our organisation. We're not cutting the number of staff. What we are doing is we're redeploying staff into key geostrategic areas. Right, we're having more people working on economic security, more people working on information and particularly disinformation, and we're having more people working in areas like technology and fighting the technology battle.
I appreciate your point, Foreign Secretary, and I'm sure when you were Chief Secretary of the Treasury you argued against every embassy sale.
I did.
I'm glad to hear it.
I absolutely did.
I'm not even slightly surprised.
My boss at the time, Philip Hammond, didn't necessarily agree with me.
Well, that's...
I can tell you, me and the then Foreign Secretary discussed it frequently, and I was always on his side.
You can publish
there we go. I will be delighted to see the letters that you're going to publish on the back of that, because it will be fascinating to see the account of various different embassy sales. Can we focus though on this question of spending, because it's not just a question of not reducing the number of personnel. We've opted out of the European Union, and that means we've got to invest more in bilateral relationships. So that's not headcount neutral. That's actually an increase. We've got significantly greater interests in many parts of the world, as advertised by a former Foreign Secretary, in embassies including Chad. That's another increase. Where are we cutting back on the influence that we've sought to have in order to increase these posts, or are we simply trying to skin the cat a little thinner?
We're not reducing our staff numbers. What we are doing is redeploying staff.
No, I hear that, but we're increasing
areas.
Our number of posts. So we're either having fewer people in more posts, in which case we're having less effect in the posts that we've already got, or we need to be increasing the number of staff. Staying staff neutral doesn't really help.
I think Philip wanted to come in on that.
So, Chair, as the Foreign Secretary has said, we're maintaining the overall numbers in the organisation. And in terms of expanding our global network, we've opened about 10 new posts. They're actually mostly quite small, and so we can do that by kind of rearranging and including some of the headquarters staff becoming deployed overseas. So it's not that we're moving people around one bit of the network and denuding it to staff another bit of the network. We're maintaining rough stability across the network. We are looking at making sure that in the headquarters, that the efficiencies we can drive out from some of the merger activity where we had duplicate functions, and B, making sure that what we are doing is against the Foreign Secretary and the government's latest priorities, is where we've got our people.
It's worth also saying, Chairman, that we are currently working on our workforce plan for next year. So we are in the throes of finalising the workforce plan and finalising the development budget for 2022-2023. So I will be able to give you more detail on exactly where people are deployed quite soon, but we're not yet at the final point of those discussions.
Okay, can we come straight back to the Ukraine question? Because clearly one area where there's going to be enormous pressure on your resources in coming days and weeks is the support needed to countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania and so on, who are dealing with migrant numbers the like of which we haven't seen since 1945 in Europe. This is pretty striking. Can you tell us what support the UK is giving to those people in those areas and to the countries that are reliant on that could do with assistance from us?
We a couple of weeks ago sent out forward deployment teams to the borders in Slovakia, in Poland. We've sent out humanitarian teams as well to support the Poles. And we're one of the largest donators of aid already. So I think we've donated 294 million in aid, of which 120 is humanitarian, 100 million on the energy sector, and 74 million of fiscal support. It's also worth saying that the DEC Ukraine appeal that we launched jointly with DEC has already reached £100 million. It's probably one of the quickest raising of funding. So we've also, I mentioned Poland and Slovakia, but we've also deployed teams to Hungary, Romania and Moldova, and we've readied more than 1,000 British troops to provide further humanitarian support. And in fact, the PM is going to be announcing more humanitarian support later this afternoon. So we really are at the forefront of providing support. We're also providing consular support in all of those locations as well.
You'll be aware that other humanitarian groups are operating. What support are we able to give to ensure that people like the ICRC are able to have the access that they need in Ukraine and offer the support they need to the civilian population?
We are doing all we can to push for humanitarian corridors. The issue has been the lack of military-to-military conversations, so these humanitarian corridors have not necessarily been protected in the way that we would want. Some of those teams have been able to access Ukraine, and we are providing aid to them. I don't know, Tom, if you want to say a bit more about that.
No, that's right. And also, you in your trip to Geneva, I mean, it was very much focus of all of that. And some of the funds we talked about dispersed have been through the ICRC and others. So you're absolutely right.
Alicia, do you want to come in on this?
It's just the point on humanitarian access. In our sanctions regime, which is absolutely welcome, there is an issue in which there's no opt-out specifically for humanitarian organisations like UN 2615 that was agreed in Afghanistan. The US have passed legislation in January to make sure that our sanctions regime allows any humanitarian actor to deal with any actor that's been sanctioned, no matter how distasteful. So will we be putting in place the same opt-out for our sanctions regime?
I mean, in short, yes. I mean, I don't know the same opt-out, but actually, it's we are making sure that actually, on the back of our sanctions regime, we don't end up impacting on the humanitarian work we're going to do. It won't be exactly the same as the US system. And one of the sort of tensions is you want to get a sanctions regime through as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. You can't. So that's the tension we're trying to do. Is you get through a sanctions regime, and then you can work out general carve-outs.
So there will be a carve-out coming specifically to protect them because they don't feel they have that protection at the moment.
Specifically how we're going to do that, I'm afraid. We can get back to you on that.
That'd be great.
You write to us on that.
Sure. Yeah.
Foreign Secretary, the UK not only leads in terms of our own donations, but in terms of influencing others, I hope, to support. And the UN is saying that only about 5% of its 1.1 billion that it's asked for to support in Ukraine has been so far achieved. What are we doing to help them fill that
We
gap?
helped. I met the UN when I was in Geneva last week. We helped with their flash appeal. We will be doing more work to galvanise humanitarian support over the next few days, and in fact that is what the Prime Minister is discussing at the moment with Prime Minister Trudeau and also Rutte as well from the Netherlands.
Thank you. Chris?
How many additional visas have been given to Ukrainians since the invasion began by the UK?
I don't have the figure, but I think
It's 50.
Yeah, the Home Secretary
It's 50.
Announced that. Yeah.
Are you not ashamed by that?
Well, the Home Secretary has announced two routes. One is the family visa route, and the other is the sponsorship route. And I know the Home Office are working very hard to issue visas.
You're not ashamed that other countries are taking in tens and tens of thousands, and we, who have known longer than any of the other countries that this was going to happen and should have been preparing for it, and your department should have been preparing for it, we've only managed to give out 50 visas so far.
I can assure you, Chris, that we have been preparing for it. We've been preparing for it since well before the end of last year. That's why we sent our forward deployment teams to locations in Poland, Slovakia, to provide direct support to people leaving Ukraine. Then? Well, it's really a matter for the Home Secretary exactly how the visa process works. So I suggest that
part of it's done by you, isn't it? Part of it's done by your department.
It's not.
People have to come to you. People have to come to your post to be able to get, as they did in Afghanistan, it was exactly the same issue, to get their biometric details taken.
I believe that's a Home Office responsibility that operates out of our post. It's Home Office personnel.
Have to go to your post to speak to Home Office. So you're saying it's the Home Office's fault that we've only managed to do 50. How does somebody in Ukraine at the moment get biometric details for a visa to come to the UK?
Would you like to?
So I can give one example on that. I mean, Foreign Secretary is absolutely right. It's a Home Office responsibility, but of course, Foreign Office fully supports that. And to give an example, so only last week we've opened up a sort of a pop-up visa application centre just on the border of the other side, the other side on the Polish border, 25 miles or so from across the border on the main road from Lviv. I think we expect the number of appointments there through that should be around sort of 6,000 a week. But that gives one example of the sort of things we're doing.
But this is run through the Home Office.
Run through the Home Office.
I think it is important to note that because
passing the buck really doesn't work as a government minister. It really doesn't.
Well,
you're all part of the same government.
I'm suggesting, absolutely, but this is the Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
Yes, and you're here as the only person speaking for the government. What I don't understand, I mean, some of us were arguing for a very long time that we should have been condemning Nord Stream 2 and getting it closed down. The British government pointedly refused to do that until remarkably recently. So it does feel as if you've been playing catch-up.
I argued for that in November last year, Chris.
Yeah, November. Some of us have been saying this for 10 years. And the British government kept on refusing to say it. So this is why some of us are a bit sceptical about this, we've been leading the world. And when you get to a situation where the UK is only... I suggest
you ask the people of Ukraine, who do see the UK as the leading supporter of Ukraine, who've been proactive in terms of supplying defensive weapons, proactive in terms of economic support, and proactive in terms of calling Russia out. And both the Prime Minister and I said that Nord Stream 2 should be stopped in November last year.
Very late in the day. But let me go back to the issue about visas. And what are the opening hours of both the post that you've just referred to and any other facilities? Are they open at the weekend since the invasion?
I don't know the opening hours, I'm afraid.
I mean, this is I said, run by the Home Office. It's a Home Office matter. And of course, we work closely with the Home Office. This is a cross-government effort.
We have posts still in Ukraine, don't we?
We don't. Our ambassador has left Ukraine because of the serious security situation.
But you don't know when people can go to the UK, but you don't know whether it's open at the weekend. You have no idea.
My understanding of the main way that people apply through the visa routes, I mean, I believe it's open continuously, but it is a service run by the Home Office in situ.
Sure. If I may add, I know the Home Office have also surged resource into all the other areas, the neighbouring states, which might also be taking by having applicants from Ukraine. But I say the nearest one to Ukraine is the one just across the border in Poland.
My understanding is that none of them are open after 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So at a time of international crisis, it just seems a bit of an own goal. And it feels like the UK has been... You see people in Berlin railway station standing there, offering their home to 6, 7, 8 Ukrainian refugees, and Britain didn't even have anything a new scheme in place.
We've had people, as I've said, forward deployment teams in Poland, in Slovakia for the last few weeks, helping with the humanitarian effort, helping get people through the border. And the Home Office have set up the new visa routes, which they are administering. They've also got online services. I'm sure that I could ask the Home Secretary, I'm sure we can get back to you with the opening hours.
Just on other refugees, because obviously we were interested in Afghanistan as well last year, and as I understand it, there are still 12,000 Afghans who have been brought to the UK, but they're still in temporary accommodation. What plans are there for Ukrainians when they come here? Will they be will they just be in a queue behind the Afghans who are still waiting for accommodation, or is there not a plan in place?
Well, I know this is what the Home Office is working on.
You don't know?
No.
Okay.
Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, can I take you back to the points you've made on the European security architecture? The government released over the weekend its 6-point plan for dealing with Ukraine, and always worries me when governments talk in those terms. It sounds a bit like a Lib Dem by-election leaflet. But can I press you on 3 of the points of the 6-point plan? The final 3, to prevent the creeping normalisation of Putin's behaviour, to pursue a diplomatic path to de-escalate, and then the last one caught my eye. It says, begin a rapid campaign to strengthen security and resilience in the Euro-Atlantic area. How do you plan to do that, and does it involve revisiting the fundamentals of the integrated review, which many of us now think needs to happen, and happen quickly?
This is one of the issues we were discussing at NATO foreign ministers on Friday, because the threat to European security is much graver now than it was. That's a statement of the obvious. We need to strengthen support to the eastern flank. We've already doubled our deployment to Estonia. Others are doing more. We're increasing our maritime support. We're increasing our air cover, and the discussion we had at NATO was about how can we increase that, but also how does NATO pursue greater technological reach in terms of hybrid warfare, challenging misinformation. How do we ensure that there are enough resources behind NATO? It's the point that is being made about defence spending, but there is a recognition that we need to shift up a gear.
Spending is always easy to call for, isn't it? Let's be honest. But strategy is what I'm trying to get at here. So there's NATO. You're right to talk about strengthening that.
There needs to be more deployment,
yep.
Particularly more deployment
on the
eastern flank.
And the GEF countries doing more. But can I ask, in terms of the integrated review, one of the things that many of us said at that time when that was published was that the UK government should pursue a comprehensive defence and security treaty with the European Union. Hasn't done that. Do you think it should now?
Well, I attended the European Union Foreign Affairs Committee alongside the Canadians and the Americans and the NATO Secretary General. And throughout this crisis, the NATO has been working very closely with the EU. The EU will be attending the next NATO meeting, and I support that close working continuing.
That's we have to be. The question I'm asking.